Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Security 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Spencer and myself, Brad. This episode, we're going to talk about industry-wide, people are addicted to EDR. And we think that they have a problem, and we're going to help them with that problem today. No, but seriously, we are going to talk about endpoint protection. And we do kind of feel like, at least I do, and I'll let Spencer speak for himself, feel like people put a lot of eggs in that basket. And especially given the fact that basically every EDR on the market can be bypassed. So pause, admin, if you like the stuff that we're doing, please, share, subscribe, rate, especially on the podcast platforms. Rating us really helps us out a lot. And yeah, so why did you choose this topic for this podcast? I'm assuming there's got to be something behind it, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is becoming a theme, in the industry that, things get popular. There's a lot of buzzwords. The industry gravitates to it. Everybody goes to use it, and it becomes this big thing. And in this episode, I wanted to talk about kind of how organizations and we see organizations overly relying on endpoint protection, right? Specifically EDR, as it's referred to. Pretty soon it's going to be XDR and MDR and enter DR type of acronym, right? Yeah. There's an over-reliance on endpoint protection to kind of save you, right? And that's what this is really about, is kind of talking about why it's a dangerous game to kind of put all of your eggs in one basket and what you're missing and, what happens if you don't detect a threat on the endpoint. Because it's not the only place a threat can live, right? And we're seeing that, with edge devices that are getting compromised, with firewalls and routers, IoT devices. We see it with Linux devices and embedded devices, right? Yep. Very sophisticated threat actors are realizing like, hey, why am I going to compromise a Windows endpoint when I can compromise this, Soho router, small office router that this organization is using and remain hidden, right? There's no EDR for that firewall, for that edge device. So the premise of this conversation is over-reliance on EDR and kind of betting on that only for your protection is a dangerous game. And, hopefully we can bring some light to this conversation.
Yeah, totally, man. And look, our travels in doing what we do in the pen testing world, we run into this pretty often, right? We'll share some war stories on this one, but one that comes to mind for me immediately is we were hacking a multinational financial organization, and they had EDR on both their Linux and Windows systems. They actually had, I think it was Carbon Black, and but their Carbon Black had gotten the wrong profile pushed down on their Linux boxes, and so in their mind they were like, "Yeah, dude, we're good." And we actually pivoted over to Linux and just ran through their environment, popping from Linux box to Linux box. Again, credentials were being reused. And so it was one of those situations where it was a misclick in the management of those EDR products. And just like that, we didn't even have to do anything, man. Yep. They were just inert for some reason. And so it was a big eye-opening experience for them, because they're like, wow, without that, you can just do whatever you wanted, and we had no visibility.
Yeah. Yeah, and something I think makes sense to have a conversation about when we talk about this, right? And we say, we see clients that are putting a lot of stock in their EDR, and, we do an internal pen test, and, it turns out, they see a bunch of stuff, but there's a lot of stuff they don't. We bring it to light to them. We say, hey, we didn't get alert for this. We think there might be some visibility gaps here. Here's why. Here's what we did. Here's how to, close that gap. Here's things to turn on or to think about. Yeah. And we realize that, there's kind of a misunderstanding of what EDR is supposed to do, what antivirus is supposed to do. It
doesn't do it all.
Right? You don't, there's a common misconception, I think, that EDR, you install it in the endpoint and it's going to protect you against everything. Right. And it's just not the case. So, EDR.
So what should it protect us from? Like, I think if we set level expectations, like, tell us what we should expect from it.
Yeah, and I think that's where that conversation goes with clients and people you talk to is, EDR, it's got endpoint in the name, right? So it's specific to an endpoint. It's got detection in the name and response in the name. So you could assume it's going to detect things and respond to them, right? Great.
Fair enough.
But to dig a little bit deeper, the EDR's job is to provide telemetry, to provide data in the form of processes that are running or that get executed, file activity, network connections, user activity, registry activity, memory, inspection, all of those things to kind of provide an analysis of all of the stuff that's happening on the endpoint, and then bring it into a system that can analyze it for malicious behavior, right? Yep. So behavior analysis is a really big component of that, and that's what is detected upon.
So you said telemetry. Tell me what that word means in the context of blue team security.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's kind of a buzzword, I guess, to use. So telemetry. When I think of telemetry, I think of all of the actions that are possible to be recorded by that software. That is telemetry. So when I log into a computer, it generates a certain amount of events. There's files written. There's programs executed. All of that stuff that happens on the endpoint, whether it can be captured by the EDR or not, that is telemetry in my mind. So if I'm modifying a file, there's a certain amount of things that happen, right? The file gets modified, gets created. There's, maybe logon processes that happen if it's on a file share or something like that. So all of that data that happens is telemetry, and it could possibly be used by the EDR to identify malicious stuff that's happening.
Yep. Makes perfect sense.
So, EDR, I think, those things, right? To bring telemetry and visibility on the endpoint to things that are happening so that the analysis engine can determine if something that is happening is bad or not. It also is used for containment, right? So if you do something bad, God bless you, by the way.
Thank you.
So if you do something bad on an endpoint or you run Mimikatz, the EDRs have the ability to not only kill processes or kill threads and kind of restart things, but also to quarantine that host from the network. So disable the network adapter, things like that. Sure. So that is the job of an EDR too, is quarantine, containment. And then the last thing I think about with EDR is threat hunting. So being able to run commands on the endpoint or inspect things that are going on the endpoint. That to me is EDR. And when we get to kind of the what if section or the scenarios, I think it'll be clear, that that's just a very small slice of all the bad things that could happen in your environment.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
So another component that I think, Brad, is kind of confusing to people is antivirus. So we've seen a number of times on engagements where clients have not only an EDR product, but they have another third-party antivirus product that's not Windows. So they'll be running, like SentinelOne plus Sophos, or Sentinel, Sophos antivirus, or Carbon Black plus McAfee, or something like that. And that's fine, for clients that want to double up or people that want to do that. But typically, in most cases, those EDRs have antivirus functions built in or capabilities built in, but the jobs are different, right? So antivirus detect known bad stuff, right? Detecting stuff based on signatures or known, known malicious behaviors, and quarantine those things.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I agree. And, antivirus is kind of antiquated at this point. It's outdated. It's uncommon even to see in most environments, at least in my experience. And it doesn't really provide a lot of value because it has limitations like you described. For example, it rarely does behavioral analysis. It occasionally will have that, but generally speaking, it's going to see something and it's going to have a list of things that are bad. And it's going to say, is that thing on my list? If it's not on my list, it's got to be good. And it just lets it roll on, which is dangerous when the things that are bad change faster than the antivirus companies can update their signatures. And so for that reason, I think this model has been broken for some time.
Yep. Yeah. And it's becoming more rare that we see just antivirus on endpoints, on client engagements. But when we do, we always hate recommending clients spend a whole bunch of money, right? But in this case, a good EDR product does go a long way
Yeah. And it is expensive. Yeah.
It is expensive, but it's a double-edged sword, right? It's, on the one hand, you need it, but you can't rely on it solely. So I think, when we get to the what if section, talking about use cases and stuff we've seen, hopefully will kind of help this argument of over reliance kind of help people listening understand what we're kind of talking about.
Yeah, totally. And just for just a brief clarity, one of the differences between the behavioral analysis that EDR brings to the table and a traditional antivirus is, if you can imagine that I write a fresh virus from scratch, right? So that means that the antivirus has no idea that it's bad, and I go to upload it into memory. And maybe I do that in a way that looks suspicious. And therefore the EDR is like, hey, I don't like the action you're performing. I don't care what the content of the file is, as opposed to antivirus. And they're like, I don't really care what you do, as long as it's not on this list of bad things that I have. Yep. And so that's kind of, what we're talking about. One of the reasons antivirus kind of died some time ago. And so I would say, if all you have is antivirus, you're in a scary place right now.
Yeah. Definitely.
But anyway, I don't want to go too far down that road. So what if? I love these scenarios you have.
So what if, right? And, this is kind of the premise of this conversation in this episode is, what if you're not ingesting all the right data that you need to identify a threat? So what I mean by that is, what if your sensor, like your endpoint sensor, is not fully configured? Maybe there's some auditing that hasn't been turned on. Or
like the scenario I described at the beginning of the episode, it was pushed an empty profile.
Exactly. So what happens, right? What else do we have to identify that threat or to identify malicious behavior and stuff like that? So, we'll talk about what to do about it, but I want to talk about these, what if scenarios to kind of get people thinking. What if the endpoint protection fails, or what if it's not there, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So what if you get so many logs or alerts that you can't triage them all, right?
Yeah.
What if there's so much volume, like you've turned everything to the max, you just can't keep up with everything that's happening, right? That's a very realistic scenario.
So, I'll tell you, one of the recent purple teams that we did, we spent 3 days in their environment, and it generated 3 alerts in one of their security systems. 3 days of us doing bad hacker things, 3 alerts were generated. And I would consider them to be a relatively mature organization. They do a good job, generally speaking, in what they do. But that, to me, is scary, right? And I think that kind of illustrates a limitation on what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Is tons of logs, 3 alerts.
Yeah, definitely. And that kind of dovetails into the next point, or the next kind of what if scenario is, what if, you have a EDR system and maybe you have an MSP, and that EDR system is sending some amount of data to, a SIM or a log aggregation system where it's getting, further analyzed by a group of analysts, right? What's common, what we see often, unfortunately, is that only, high and critical alerts from the EDR are getting sent to the MSP, to the log aggregator, to the SIM, whatever the case may be over there. You're missing out on all the medium alerts, the low alerts, all the other data that you might be missing out on that's not an alert. Mm-hmm. So when you have a situation like that, you want to make sure that you're getting the right data into the right systems, that you can act on it so that you have context for those things. And that's why you shouldn't just rely on EDR alone, right? If you aren't sending those logs, you need to find out, what's going on in your network some other way, or have, some other method to identify that bad stuff.
Yeah. Pro tip to the security community: Kerber roasting should not be a low event.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
but that's what we see from time to time. We will see an event come across from an MSSP or from an internal security team, and they're like, "Yeah, we got this alert. Thought you guys might be interested." And it's like Kerber roasting low, and we're like, "Yeah, are you kidding me?"
Yeah, and especially in the last scenario we'll talk about is moving, when attackers move their tools off of the endpoint and they proxy it in. Mm-hmm. If there's no activity on the endpoint, and then all of a sudden you see a couple accounts that are requesting service tickets with RC4, maybe you're like, no big deal.
It's fine. The printer always does that.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a common one with tools that have a cloud component, which is pretty much all of them now.
Yeah.
What if there's a firewall networking issue? Like, what if the attacker prevents that host from reaching out to that mothership some way? Or maybe there's just a networking issue and those logs can't get there.
Yep.
Or the product's misconfigured and they don't end up getting there. Then what, right?
Yeah.
Those are all things that can kind of go wrong. The last two are, what if, and this is, I guess, the next one is kind of more what you would expect, a pen tester to say is like, what if we bypass it, right? What if we evade the EDR and like they don't see it, which is probably the smallest of scenarios, right? Like we do evade stuff, but all those other things are probably way more common.
Oh yeah, absolutely. If your EDR is installed, configured, and everything's working properly, there is a strong chance that you're going to get some indicators that we're in your environment. But more often than not, like you said, things like exclusions, things like like you said, disabling it, stuff like that is the stuff that we're going to leverage. But half the time we don't even have to. Half the time we're like, oh, cool, you have EDR XYZ. It's not configured right. We're just going to move off this machine and move on to another one. Yeah,
and the last kind of scenario is, to your point, what you just said is attackers are getting smart now. They realize that operating on the endpoint is getting very dangerous and very cost effective from an OPSEC perspective. It's harder to blend in. It's harder to evade all of the data and the telemetry that EDR software has. So they're now, running their C2. They've got their implant running on the host, and they're proxying, their tools in. So they're not running them directly on the host. They're running them locally on the attacker machine, proxying them in. And by doing so, they evade, or they don't generate noise on the endpoint. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then it becomes, what do you do about it, right? How do you strategize from that point?
Yep. And so, okay, so let me ask you this. What is your number one destination when you move laterally off of a workstation?
Oh, for me, most of the time it's a server.
Why?
Yeah. Most of the time it's a server. And it's because traditionally, IT admins, they need to get their work done, and, they don't like things getting in the way, and, maybe they'll turn the EDR off or create more exclusions, or just overall just relax the security controls a little bit on the servers because they need to get work done.
Yep. Same thing, so my favorite thing to do was, how often do you see default credentials on printers for the admin page? Almost always, right? Like it's 80, 90%. We would just upload malicious firmware that had, a tuned down version of Kali on it.
Yep.
And it's like, why is my printer, brute forcing our LDAP instance? Well, it's because it's not your printer anymore. It's my printer and I'm running Kali on it.
Yeah. Exactly. And
it doesn't have EDR, by the way.
Yeah. And all those things, like we mentioned, what if you're not on the endpoint and you're acting on some other device?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So what do you do about it, right? Like we said all this, talked about all these use cases, like what if, endpoint fails? I think the core message is don't just rely on the endpoint protection alone, right? It's very good. It's gotten very advanced. There are some very good products out there that are seeing a lot of the activity that we do on these engagements, but that does create a single point of failure. That does create a single place to, once you get around that, you're pretty much golden, right? Mm-hmm. In most environments. So that would be a core message of this is don't rely on the endpoint protection alone. Make sure you have other detective and preventive controls in place.
Yep. Agreed.
So, in saying that, I think it's easy to say that. I think what we advise clients and what we see catching us time and time again, we do purple teams, we do other offensive engagements, is network monitoring, right?
Yes.
If you can look east and west and see that, hey, there's a whole bunch of LDAP queries to all these hosts, that is going to be pretty suspicious. That might be indicative of, the Sharpound, Bloodhound collector, Sharpound, right? If you're performing LDAP queries, a bunch of them in a short amount of time from a single host, that is pretty suspicious. Or if you're password spraying or Kerberoasting. Those kinds of things are not necessarily on endpoint detections, more network based, Active Directory based, identity based. Something to combat those threats, to identify those threats is going to be very beneficial.
Yep. And for those who are not familiar with the east-west terminology, we consider north-south traffic to be leaving your environment, right, and coming into your environment. We consider east-west traffic to be traffic between endpoints and other systems within the environment, right? Is that what you're?
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, that's what we use that terminology just so we can differentiate. When we say traffic, and we want you to do both, by the way. You need to have visibility into what's leaving your environment, and even to a lesser degree, what's coming in. Hopefully, not much, but yeah.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that network segregation, right? Yeah. We have been environments from time to time that are very restricted at the host level.
And
so
we're
even
always
though you're on that host,
we're always excited to see that. So.
Yeah, even though you're on the host, it's probably not a lot to talk to. There's just they're completely isolated. It's the zero trust model. We're seeing now identity products getting really good. So identity products are able to identify when there's past the hash, or when you're abusing tokens, or when you're requesting a ticket that is somewhat malicious looking, or it's not requested in the same way that a typical ticket would be requested. Those are getting really good. Honeypots, obviously, probably one of the best things you can do in terms of low false positives.
Oh, and cost of value, dude, is insane.
Yeah. And we say all this to kind of drive home the point that you shouldn't just rely on endpoint protection. You need all these other things to have a very defensible strategy. To have a defensible environment, and don't just rely on EDR alone.
No question. And look, it's part of a defense in depth strategy, right? We've all heard that catchphrase. We have seen, and I think part of the driving force for having this conversation with you today is that we've kind of seen this shift away from that to some degree. And not that people are intentionally shifting away from defense in depth, but they just really love the ADR, man, because it is so good. It does such a great job.
Yep.
But it is not perfect. And I think everybody needs to understand that.
Yeah. And something we didn't really talk about is kind of the way that they're marketed, right? And the way that those products are sold.
Oh, don't even get me started on that, man.
Makes people think that, that don't know any better, or that haven't dug into it deeply, or are not practitioners, that, like, if you're talking about C-level people, executives, management, who are kind of strategizing, making the decisions, they might not understand how that marketing is kind of, being a little bit skewed, or kind of manipulated in a way that makes you think that it's going to stop all of these things. That also plays into the problem as well of not being able to really, identify what else you need other than this one product. You need this.
It's 100% successful in all test cases.
Yeah.
So what could go wrong?
Exactly.
So, all right, cool, man. So that's all we have for you today, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening, / watching if you're on YouTube. If you enjoyed this, check us out on our offsec.blog website, where we're putting out a lot of cool stuff, and subscribe, and rate with whatever platform you have. We'll see you next Wednesday.